Dharwad is conducting two special lecture series in 2022, namely Makers of Modern World Theatre and Revisiting Shakespearean Theatre. In this connection, 2 weeks ago, that is the first week of July, we started the first series, Makers of Modern Theatre. The second lecture series, that is Revisiting Shakespearean Theatre, is starting today. Today, we have with us Professor Rajendra Chenni, a renowned writer, critic from Shivamogga. I welcome you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
I also welcome Professor Basavaraja Donur, President, Dharwad Katte, and Registrar, Central University of Karnataka. Welcome, sir. I also welcome the Advisory Board Committee, statutory members, and all the members of Dharwad Katte and our press media persons and all the audience who are with us on all the social medias on this and also on this virtual platform. Our pattern is first Professor Rajendra Chenni sir speak for about 60 minutes, followed by President Professor Basavaraja Donur sir's talk, and after that we have discussion and question session. Now, a few words about Professor Rajendra Chenni. Professor Rajendra Chenni, who taught in Karnataka College, Dharwad, Sahyadri College, Shivamogga, and he was also heading the Department of English at Kuvempu University, Shivamogga. He bagged GSS Award and Karnataka Sahitya Academy Award as well. His well-known writings include Traditions of Modernity, a comparative studies of T.S. Eliot and Gopal Krishna Adiga, and Desivada, Bendre Kavya Sampradaya Mattu Swantike. Speaking of someone, of men words, and many. We are very much happy to listen to you, sir. Now, over to Professor Rajendra Chenni, sir. Sir, please.
Well, thank you for those words of welcome and introduction. I hope I am audible to all the participants.
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Even as I begin my presentation and look outside my window, I see a weather which is very dark and murky and rainy. And it's exactly like the atmosphere that we find in the play Macbeth by Shakespeare. Exactly at a time when the day is dying out and the forces of the night are expected to descend any moment. It's in such an atmosphere that I shall be speaking about Macbeth, and later during my presentation I hope to say a few things about how the atmosphere of ambivalence and ambiguity, where human beings are lost somewhere between the light of rationality and the forces of irrationality, and how Shakespeare is able to integrate the question of order in nature and order in the human world. Therefore, today's weather provides, to me at least, some kind of an appropriate atmosphere to talk about the play Macbeth. The title I have chosen for my presentation is Macbeth, the Making of a Tyrant. The title itself is an acknowledgement. It is an acknowledgement of a brilliant work by Stephen Greenblatt, the new historicist and leading practitioner of that school of criticism, which is titled Tyrant. In this extraordinarily brilliant work, with a large number of insights into Shakespearean society and the plays and the figures which appear in the plays of Shakespeare. Greenblatt tries to deal with the figure of the tyrant in the major plays of Shakespeare. He focuses on both the political plays and some of the different kinds of plays by Shakespeare, where at the very center of the stage you have a very charismatic, a very disturbing, a very ambivalent kind of a person who transforms himself into a tyrant and thereby causes a lot of disturbance in the social and the moral order. Stephen Greenblatt, of course, makes a detailed analysis of such characters. For example, of Richard III and Julius Caesar, Macbeth, and even King Lear, because despite the sympathy that we have towards King Lear at the end of the play, at the beginning, he is a tyrant. Tyrant not only in the domestic sphere of the family, but also in the society that he has been ruling with a very firm and stern hand. One thing that we notice in the book by Stephen Greenblatt is, though he makes a certain very interesting comments on Macbeth as the figure of the tyrant, in the context of the entire work, one gets the feeling that the play Macbeth and the character of Macbeth are somewhat tangential or marginal to the arguments that Greenblatt is trying to, justify through the analysis of this place. And maybe we can start our discussion of the play by trying to answer why this happens. And before I do that, I have to mention one of the frames used by Stephen Greenblatt, which might be of great help to us even in understanding the play Macbeth. Greenblatt's argument is that Shakespeare is, in fact, writing about the climate of ideas, the political ideologies, the politico social structures of his own society, of his own time. But this was a period of controlled turbulence, if one could use that phrase. There was a great deal of uncertainty about politics, and whatever order and balance that one could find in the society of Shakespeare was more or less of a symbolic kind. There were political factions, there were extremely competitive and ambitious earls and lords, and the great Queen Elizabeth. She had to, in a way, try throughout her career to balance these vociferous forces, these divisive forces in her society. It was an extremely violent society, and a society which was always frightened of possible destruction of the moral and the social order. And also, there was a fear that the authority of the king or the queen was always under suspicion, and there was nothing like a permanence that one could look for. Now, to talk about such contemporary contentious issues, politically very volatile issues, was not safe at all. Therefore, Greenblatt suggests that Shakespeare uses the technique of what Greenblatt describes as displacement. Instead of writing directly and topically about the times and the society of his own, Shakespeare takes us to social worlds which are historically very distant. Just as we see here It happens in Scotland. King Lear happens elsewhere, and there is a vast distancing as far as the time and the space are concerned. And Greenblatt correctly argues that this technique helps Shakespeare to write very forcefully, very confidently, and very critically about his own times, because the spectator of his theater would certainly understand the political nuances, and he would see the refractions of his own life and his own society, though the action on the stage would be happening elsewhere, imagined elsewhere, centuries ago, in some far off place, etc. I entirely agree with Greenblatt, because this was the time of spies and rumors and immediate executions, even of the mightiest aristocrats of the time. And this helps him in identifying certain features which may be ideological or psychological of leaders who have power but who turn out to be tyrants. In fact, one could argue that Shakespeare was all the while writing about such possibilities of the creation of tyrants in his own time, though, of course, he talks about Caesar and King Lear and others. Coming back to the point I had raised earlier, why is it that in this work of Greenblatt, Macbeth seems to be a little marginalized, and you get the feeling that the play and the character are somewhat tangential to the main argument? I would argue that the problem that Greenblatt and many critics have faced is, to begin with, does Macbeth really have a stake in power? If you're talking about a tyrant and a political system and the struggle for power, then naturally one would expect that the protagonist or the hero would have a direct kind of a stake in the power. It happens in the other place. King Lear is, after all, king. And then you have Richard, who belongs to the monarchy. And in play after play, there is a direct kind of a relationship between the figure of the tyrant and the power and becoming the tyrant. If you look at the beginning of Macbeth, I don't think you have any evidence that here is Macbeth who has such a stake in power. He is, as you saw in the early scenes, which were shown to us at the beginning of this program, he's a brave Thane, a brave general, a very great soldier, and he has imbibed all these characteristics of a very valorous and a brave soldier and a leader on the battlefield. He does have all those qualities. There are frequent references to his being the bridegroom of Bellona, the goddess of war. The brave Macbeth is repeatedly the way in which he is addressed. But if you look at it, does the play immediately establish somewhere that he has a stake in the political power? I don't think there are very strong grounds to argue this. Of course, we are all familiar with one question which critics have taken up. The argument that in the Scotland that is presented to us in the play, the future king would not be necessarily an heir of the royal family. There was also a system of electing and nominating. And Macbeth, of course, is a relation of King Duncan, and he does mention it himself. And therefore, there are critics who argue that the ambition of Macbeth is not really unexpected, because perhaps he believed that the traditions of political governance in his Scotland also allowed for someone who is a relation but not a direct heir or descendant. This may be true. This may be one of the ideas that is worked up by Macbeth in his mind. But I would again say that this cannot be a solid ground for assuming that here is a hero who has a direct stake in the question of power. I don't think I need to make comparisons, because most of the figures of the tyrant in Shakespeare's plays are familiar to us, who seem to have a far more direct, stake in the power struggle. Secondly, we find that Macbeth here um, has those qualities which are very greatly admired by the Scotland of his times. In the play, in two places, you find a long list, of what one expects. On the one hand, from the king, and on the one hand, from a noble aristocratic person. And all those qualities he seems to possess here. I have already mentioned these a while ago. But does this fully explain what happens in the play Macbeth? In the short, beginning of you saw, I hope you remember when the veiled sisters or the witches speak to Macbeth and Banquo, and they pronounce that he is going to be the Thane of Cawdor, and he will also be the future king of Scotland. The reaction of Macbeth is of being shocked and a little disturbed, uh, and I would even say psychologically a little troubled. And this is noticed by Bang, who asks him why this kind of a response when they are, predicting the very best things for you. Perhaps if you enter the discussion from this particular perspective, the Macbeth that listens to the prophecy of the three witches perhaps has already thought about it, and perhaps there's already some kind of struggle in his mind, of a conflict between the values that he has been representing so far, of absolute loyalty to the king, to the community of the Thames, and also to the domestic world. And then, of course, his martial qualities and values. They are there on the one hand, and on the other hand, these very brief responses. Later on, of course, we have long soliloquies which take us directly into the conscious and the unconscious mind of Macbeth. But at this point of time, maybe he has dreamt about it, he has thought about it, as Lady Macbeth also comments later. But that has never been some kind of a feasible project for Macbeth. The idea of probably somehow entering into power may have been with him, but that has never been a political praxis or a project for him. This is what the play makes very clear to us. Now, if this is so, are we then witnessing in our drama the psychological frameworks taking over, maybe even at the cost of the actual political realities, where we as readers and audience are persuaded by Shakespeare to look essentially at the psychological drama which relates to the transformation of Macbeth from a brave general putting down a seditious uprising and rebellion in favor of King Duncan, and he himself becomes a seditious conspirator. Does it mean that we need to look only at this universal frameworks of human nature and the propensity to evil? This has been the discussion in the traditional reading and criticism of Macbeth. I would suggest that we return to a question which the critics of the earlier generations had raised, and maybe look for an answer to this question. The question I've been raising is, here is a very different kind of tyrant in Shakespeare who does not have a direct stake in the power struggle. And secondly, his own declared values and his way of life have not so far shown any space for such kind of brutish ambition in him. Then are we only witnessing a psychological drama showing a peripety and change in the tragic protagonist? My answer to this would be, suppose we avoid these very simple judicial kinds of comments, and we also avoid a very simple ethical framework of a good man becoming a bad human being. Suppose we keep them aside for a little while and ask this question: why is it that we then sympathize with Macbeth? This is a question that was raised by the earlier generation of critics, and I think it still continues to be a very important question. The question is, this play, according to Harold Bloom, may not, produce the expected twin feelings of pity and terror, because, according to him, the basic response of the readers is likely to be that of terror, and by terror, he extends the Aristotelian framework to mean that for the spectators and the readers, the feeling towards Macbeth may not be something that can be described as pity or understanding, but something more than that, where the play forces us to consider ourselves as Macbeth. I think there's a lot of sense in the argument made by Harold Bloom, and he's trying to put it not in the usual sense of spectators imaginatively identifying with the character called Macbeth. It is something deeper in this analysis, and that is, somewhere we discover, along with Macbeth, that just beneath this veneer or outward mask of civility, civilized values, societal values, there lurks in us, in every Macbeth, and everybody is a Macbeth, says Harold Bloom. We discover that there are these elemental forces which are not curbed or monitored by any sense of civilized order. The play, after all, deals with the great issue of order and disorder. I shall be elaborating on that in a couple of minutes. I was trying to share with you this possible interpretation that probably you need a Freudian framework or a psychoanalytical framework, because what you are witnessing before you is yourself there in action. Because For Macbeth, it is a discovery, something that has to be more clearly articulated by Lady Macbeth. And then, of course, in the second stage of his change and transformation, he himself becomes more open and articulate about what was hidden in him and now which becomes manifest through violence and through cruelty. So, probably the framework we require is such a framework where Shakespeare seems to be grappling in a very complex way of how the civilizational values. Please remember one of the most important lines in the play, which tells us that human beings and human societies have evolved in history and now they have been made civil in the sense that primitive kind of expression only of aggression, only of lust for power. These have been gradually shaped, put down through the civilizational norms. That's exactly what Freud also talked about in his very great work, Civilization and its Discontents. I think here in this play, Shakespeare is directly confronting this kind of conflict between civilized values, values of social and moral order, and the forces in us which we may not discover very quickly, but these are the forces which are chaotic, which are uncontrollable, and always a constant threat to human societies and civilization. This is not an entirely new perspective. We have always read Macbeth from this particular point of view. Duncan, the paternalistic, somewhat innocent kind of a ruler, for the Scots, for the Scottish people, represents this sense of order, which has been recently disrupted by the former Thane of Cawdor, who has also got help from some other Thanes. But this has been now suppressed by Macbeth and Banquo and the other loyal, Thanes and leaders. And there is this sense of restored order. We begin with the commotion, we begin with the sedition, we begin with the challenge to the authority of the king, but very quickly, the values of loyalty and dedication symbolized by Macbeth have restored that order. And what we see after the turbulence caused by the weird sisters and the three witches is the atmosphere at the castle of Macbeth, where Duncan comes as an overnight guest. I hope you will all remember the beautiful lines in which the quietude, the silence, and the solacing atmosphere is described again very ironically by Shakespeare because this castle for Duncan seems to present the greatest values of domesticity, domestic peace, and also the values of being a host, being a host to a visiting guest. But what is lurking and what comes out within a couple of hours is that beneath this domesticity, beneath this pleasantness, there lurk the powers which are brutal, which are violent, and which make nonsense of the beliefs we have in being good hosts and etc. etc. And of course, there is also the suggestion that Macbeth is some kind of a son, though he is only a relation. He's some kind of he could have been some kind of a son to Duncan, mainly because of the suppressed admiration and love that even Macbeth has towards Duncan. You know, and even Lady Macbeth, very surprisingly, because you remember she refuses to kill Duncan, though she would very much want to do, because while sleeping, he looks very much like her father, she says. Therefore, I would say that what we again witness as we move into the play is a double process. In the political social world, the values are being turned upside down. The most loyal and dedicated thief becomes the murderer of the king. This convolution of the socio-political order is paralleled by the war that is taking place in the mind of Macbeth. And that is, I think, where one can explain why we feel sympathy for Macbeth, because for some more time to come, before he becomes a ruthless, violent tyrant, there are very strong moral compunctions in Macbeth. A lot of debate has happened regarding whether the play can be called Christian or pre-Christian, because there are very strong elements of Christian values here in the play. And the most disturbing of them, as I can remember, is when Macbeth sees the two sons speaking in their sleep and saying, "Let us pray," and the other one says, "Amen to that." He can't. And that's a very, very painful question for him, even in the midst of a happening murder. The most disturbing question for Macbeth is, why is it that I have now become incapable of prayer? So there are these strong patterns of Christian values, of guilt, though not much of repentance, of guilt, of sin, of transgression of the moral and the ethical values. So the play, I think, moves parallelly between these possibilities of turbulence and things going upside down, both at the level of the individual and at the level of the socio-historical structures, because the murder of Duncan is not just a question of succession. It's a question of the destruction of an order, of that sense of order that has been upset. And we quickly see after the murder of Duncan that the attempts made by Macbeth and Lady Macbeth to bring some pretense of order by the anointing of Macbeth very quickly as the king, and then the banquet where Macbeth very clearly says everybody will sit according to his degree and status. So it's like the banquet is expected to be like a replica of the social order, but then it is disrupted by the ghost of Banquo and the extraordinary behavior of Macbeth. I would say that in this first stage of the transformation of Macbeth, there is a genuine struggle between the moral compunctions and the received values and the larger values of a Christian system of belief, and the conflict is with the other choices that Macbeth is forced into. In fact, the best way of understanding Macbeth is to listen to Lady Macbeth before Macbeth arrives at the castle. Um, has sent a letter, and Lady Macbeth, reading it, she informs us directly about the reasons why Macbeth cannot be a tyrant. He can be, he should be, she wants to make him into a tyrant, but she also knows why it is going to be a very difficult process, because she says, my husband, Macbeth, is full of the milk of human kindness. And ironically, though he wants certain things, he does not want the doing to be, sinful or criminal. I think this is an exact description of Macbeth, by Lady Macbeth, that he is certainly not a saint, certainly not unaffected by the lust for power, etc. But at the same time, somebody who appears to her to be not fully a man. Maybe I should say a thing or two here, of something that has been discussed again and again. This is the way in which Lady Macbeth, later, just before the murder and after the murder at the banquet, she goads Macbeth into action, the action she wants, the killing of Duncan and the taking over of the reign and rule of Scotland. She does this by her innuendos about manliness, you see. And there are many contemporary critics who have even found this to be grounded in kind of a sexual, insecurity that is talked about, as though Macbeth is somewhat lacking in it. Everybody may not agree with this interpretation, but there is certainly a reference. I would say that this reference has, to manliness or not being man enough, and then goading Macbeth to be a man. This is not just the maneuvering by Lady Macbeth. I would say that in the process of the making of a tyrant, hyper masculinity becomes one of the values. The gentle milk of kindness in Macbeth has to be removed, it has to be displaced, because one of the abilities that a tyrant should possess is the ability to dehumanize himself. The process we see in the play is of Macbeth programmatically, then also by being goaded into this acceptance of the identity which Lady Macbeth wants to give him. I don't think anybody today would talk about Lady Macbeth as the fourth witch or anything. What is happening here is that in this highly intimate relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, who do not have children, who are so attached to each other, the important question there is that Macbeth has to be transformed for the sake of power into someone who no longer has those moral compunctions, or even if those moral compunctions continue, he should be able to suppress those compunctions and present an acceptable personality to the society and those in the court. It happens, all right. But then the other issue is this I was pointing out, the process of dehumanizing oneself, because you are now making the choice of accepting a different identity for you, not that of a loyal, totally dedicated Thane, but of someone who wants all power to himself, that is a tyrant. So I see these stages in the process being presented to us. One is the renunciation and the giving up of the domestic values, of the family values. I'm saying this because remember, once the murder takes place and the banquet scene is over, we hardly see Lady Macbeth. There is no longer that intimate exchange between the two. And Macbeth seems to emerge on his own, but as a very unpleasant person, a cruel and violent and self-centered tyrant. And the process involves, as I said, renunciation of the accepted norms and values of a social order, of a domestic sphere, and also of the politics of that particular society. Then there is this willed dehumanization, willful dehumanization of oneself. One can see that the transformation is marked in the play. Um, One could see that the way Macbeth decides. In the rest of the things earlier, his wife was a co-conspirator and maybe even a guru for him. But at a particular point, when he decides that the wife and the children of Macduff have to be killed, that's the point where he says, "My problem has been that I think, I ruminate, I reflect, and that becomes a postponement of the action. Now he says, I have to transform myself into a person who executes, who acts, even when the ideas are fresh to his own mind. And from then onwards, you will find him, like a man of action. Of course, every action by him turns out to be violent and cruel. What does this have to do with the society of Shakespeare? Because I began by saying that with all this displacement, distancing, Shakespeare was engaged with his own society. I feel that this society of transition, I don't want to enter into a sociological analysis, which I would very much want to, but we don't have time for that. But this society of transition was finding itself sometimes gradually, sometimes very roughly, moving from a certain set of values to the values of the new age. Let's not forget that this was the age of, age which looked forward to imperialism. This was the society where gold and money had become objects of worship. And it was a society where there was some kind of general feeling, a public sentiment that the old values were no longer powerful enough to understand the dynamism of this new world. I hope I am clear to you. Imperialism, the growth of capital in a very different way. After all, we are talking about a pre-industrial society, and then also a changed view of governance and governmentality. I'm sure you have observed this, that Duncan is a very paternalistic kind of a ruler who doesn't even participate in the war, but he is a representative of probably the old wisdom, of a respected leader, etc. Whereas when you look at the governance introduced by Macbeth, once he comes on his own, this is nothing but the mechanics of violence. Because of two important reasons which are explored by Shakespeare again and again. The tyrant may appear to be fully secure and strong, invincible, somebody who can never be defeated, is a man of steel. That is not true at all. In all the portrayals of the tyrants in Shakespearean drama, the tyrant is insecure. The tyrant has a suspicion about his own power and about his own charisma, about his own leadership. In play after play, you will find that there are these chinks in the armor, as we say. And in fact, why go to critics? Macbeth himself says that if Banquo's son has survived, then my plan of becoming perfect, steel like, without the least kind of a weakness or a lacuna in my personality, this fails because his son has escaped. Now, though he speaks about his longing to become this kind of a perfect tyrant, enjoying perfect power, even by blocking the future, uh, where Banquo's sons should not become kings of Scotland, not only the present but the future. But the truth is, and that's the truth that Shakespeare is driving us to the understanding of, and that is the tyrant is insecure, and therefore he keeps finding security only through what I described as the mechanics of violence. So kill one after another, kill your own dearest friend, suspect, disloyalty to your authority in everybody, plan, and even when you want to, look at that, even when you have already appointed two murderers to kill Banco, you send one more person, right? The third murderer has to be sent. And that becomes an obsession. So, what we are watching here is by a choice, because as we all know, Macbeth knows extremely well, and he says it at the end of the play, in the middle of the play, and earlier also. The weird sisters have no power to change his fate. Their predictions are ambiguous. It could be this, it could be something else. But the choice and the responsibility of the choice rests with Macbeth himself. See, this is a play about one's culpability and one's vulnerability and also one's responsibility. You are responsible for the actions that you take up and the choices that you make. This is the world presented here. And that's the reason why I want to go along with Harold Bloom, who says, this is the terrifying play which first tells you that you are Macbeth, and therein you is a Macbeth. And a Macbeth, I mean a particular Macbeth, may find justification in the words of the three witches, but he has to make his own choice. You see, and thereafter we see that the choice involves political actions which go with any tyrant, suspicion of others, suspicion of disloyalty, and valorizing yourself, putting yourself at the center of everything, trying to create. Of course, it's very difficult for Macbeth, and he fails, but at least attempting to create yourself as an unquestioned figure of power, renunciation of loyalty to the family. After all, when the news of Lady Macbeth is her death is brought to him, what does one make of his words? Yes, should have died hereafter. What is he trying to say? How is it that he quickly begins to use the word business for the murder, first of Duncan and then of Banku, and then the attempted murder, which of course succeeds as far as Macduff's family is concerned. The last of the points, I'm sure I can take in the 5 to 7 minutes, is important to me. One question we should ask when reading this play is, how is it that this very tightly written play, extraordinary in its tight structure, how is it that this play provides so much of space to resistance? This is a play not just about a man becoming a tyrant and the consequent loss of order and harmony in society. There is the question of resistance also. One of the comments I liked, which may indirectly add to my arguments, is the play was to be performed probably in the presence of the king later, and one who was a descendant of the family from Scotland. And he was also the king, one who talked about the divine power of kingship. In Shakespearean society, um, order and sense of order went the the presence of a good king. And in the play Macbeth, you do have a mention of king-like qualities. What are the qualities that one would expect in the king? And that was because these were the political ideologies of that period. Uh, a divine kingship of the king, then the question of the miraculous powers of the king. Don't forget that when Macduff and Malcolm and others go to England in order to seek the help of the English king, the King Edward was said to be a saint-like person. He's also attributed with extraordinary supernatural power because the touch by the king would be a healing touch and diseases would be cured. This was one of the beliefs in Shakespeare's time also, though it was said about Edward. Here was a public discussion going on in the connection between a strong monarchy, an ideal king, and order and civilization in society. This is one thing. Another thing that I find very important in the play is the space given to opposition and resistance. In fact, the power of Macbeth is very short lived, almost immediately, even when the knocking on the gate takes place after the night in which Duncan is killed. There are suspicions about Macbeth. The children of Duncan run away, and later the others also begin to question Macbeth. But there is resistance. What I find extremely interesting is if you look at the things spoken by Malcolm and then also by Macduff in England, there are constant references to Scotland, unfortunate country. Under Macbeth, she is no longer our mother. The people are full of rumors and suspicion, but they are also gathering up in order to resist the tyrant. One of the important things about the presence of the tyrant in Shakespearean's plays is there's always resistance. And this short play, it is said to be the shortest of the tragedies. It gives a lot of space to, those who join the resistance. Not only Macduff and the children of Duncan, you also have Ross and Lennox and many of them who cross over and who want to join. And and when the war begins, Macbeth himself says, they are my own thanes and soldiers who are now fighting for my enemy and against me, he says. So there is a resistance, and I would say that Shakespeare's extraordinary power is to make this resistance not the resistance by only rivals, competitors, and who may come into power. This is a resistance by the most common human beings, whether it's the old man, talking, or whether it is the reports given by Lennox and then Ross and others of how people are looking at it, and how a society threatened by violence, monitored by a tyrant, is also rejecting him. There is no simple question of who will take over after Macbeth's defeat. The larger question is our nationality, our Scotland, the values of Scotland, etc. Therefore, the resistance seems to come from the society itself, which suffers under tyranny. I think that has a lesson for all of us in 21st century world, um, where many forms of tyranny seem to be oppressing societies all across the globe. And a writer like Shakespeare, who wrote for his people, for his times, is also a prophet because he talks about possibility of resistance from those who are not involved in power, from those ordinary human beings who don't have a stake in power. That I think is the importance of the play. Um, so I would like to stop here for the discussion. I'm sure you may have questions to ask me. And meanwhile, I thank the participants for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now I request Professor Basavaraj Donur, President Dharwad Katte, to speak a few words. Sir, please.
Good evening. Prakash, am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible, sir. Please.
Good evening to you. First of all, I thank Professor Rajendra Chenni, sir, for accepting our invitation and delivering first talk of this special series on Macbeth. We all know that Professor Rajendra Chenni is a powerful writer in Kannada as well as in English. He writes and speaks very effectively both in Kannada and English. He's one of the finest professors of English that the state of Karnataka has ever seen, and we all admire him for his profound knowledge in literature, language, culture, and etc. He delivered a very brilliant, important talk, and in his talk, he has touched upon all the important dimensions of the play, and he gave a lot of insights into this very important play by William Shakespeare. And his discussion on Greenwald's views on Shakespeare is extremely new and exciting for all of us. So we have been greatly benefited by Professor Chenni's talk today, and I thank him on behalf of Dharwad Katte and on behalf of all the viewers. And we all know that Shakespeare is the greatest playwright in the world, and I don't have to explain why he has been regarded as the greatest playwright of the world. Macbeth is an important tragedy. In this play, we all know that Shakespeare examines the nature of evil. Professor Chenni has very, very clearly, brilliantly talked about the tyranny and about the tyrant and so on. And he has also given us a lot of clues as to how we can read the play and interpret the play. The psychological dimensions of the play have to be analyzed. And we can make serious attempt to analyze this play from the point of view of psychology and so on. I am also concerned about the nature of evil in this play. What kind of evil Shakespeare is trying to present to us in this play. So we also know that he presents a powerful vision of evil in this play. Stephen Greenwald is an authority on Shakespeare. I too have read two books of him on Shakespeare. And he says Macbeth is Shakespeare's most celebrated and memorable tyrant. So about tyranny, he has, Greenwald has written very brilliantly. He tells us who is a tyranny and why does one become a tyrant. That's an important question. And I think it's easy to be violent. It's very difficult to be non-violent. And a tyrant is violent. And what makes him to become a tyrant is not just a political question. It's not just a historical question. It is also a psychological question. Professor Chenni has talked about it. See, a normal man, a right-thinking man, and a normal and right-thinking man cannot become a tyrant. A tyrant will have his own psychological problems. He may lack in many things, including sex or sexuality. And Sir has also talked about it. He has this problem. Has this problem. And we cannot come to conclusion that Macbeth became ambitious or ambition him is aroused when he met the three Wade sisters. It's not like that. So their desire to become a king, the desire to become a king is not inherent in him. And why does he why does he decide? Why does he decide to kill Duncan is a big question. It's not that he wants to be or he wanted to be a king, because Lady Macbeth, his wife, makes fun of his sexuality. That's an important thing, and she forces him to prove his manliness. That to prove that he is not important, to prove that he doesn't lack in sexuality, I think he takes the tough decision to kill Duncan, and it has its own repercussions as well. So this is an important play which can be read from the psychological perspective. He talked about psychoanalysis. It can also be read from several other perspectives. And for many of the contemporary questions, there are answers to this play. Professor Chenni has also talked about the violence that the violence that we can see across the globe, and there is answer in Shakespeare and in this play. So I once again thank Professor Chenni for accepting our invitation, giving a brilliant talk. Now the audience can interact with him. Over to Dr. Prakash Parikai. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now the session is open for discussion. Audience can give their opinions, ask the questions, and interact with Professor Chenni sir directly. The very uniqueness of this series is Dharwad Katte is conducting the English series for the first time, except one talk we had in English earlier. So today is the first talk in English in a series. So audience can interact, they can ask questions, give their opinions.
I saw a question. Hello? Am I audible?
Yes, sir,
Yes,
you are
sir.
audible, sir. Yes.
Maybe on the scroll or somewhere there was a question whether the third murderer is Macbeth himself.
Yes.
This is one of the um, you know interpretations, and I don't think it is very acceptable, because if you look at the conversation among the three, two are surprised that there is a third one, and then the escape of Banco's son is possible mainly because of a lack of understanding among the three when the torch is put off, and there is no coordination between the first two and the third one, etc., etc. And I think it's somewhat outlandish to think that the third murderer. There's also been a suggestion that one of the, not a thane really, but one of the powerful persons went there. I don't think we need to, because it doesn't really add to our understanding of the play. It's clearly uh, two mercenary killers who have been promised by Macbeth. There's a long lecture. He reads out to the murderers and says, I have clearly proved to you that all your problems are because of Banco, and therefore I want you to do this. See, that is how it happens in the play. That's my answer to this question I saw somewhere on the scroll.
Others can ask the questions. We
Sir,
have
good evening, sir.
Yes.
Sir, would you please suggest some critical books on Macbeth?
On Macbeth, uh, there's a whole Macbeth industry, in my view. Thousands of books are written. Practically, even when I was making a presentation, I don't know how many books on Macbeth may have come out during this period. Um, what I suggest, if you are a student or a young scholar, this is not for others. Um, the best way of reading any play by Shakespeare is to first look for a very authentic, well edited, annotated text, something which is very dependable, like perhaps the Clarendon edition, Alden edition. A lot of scholarly work has gone into the preparation of these texts, and the information which goes even into the footnotes there is very valuable, because it's a it's a scholarly process of trying to understand the texture of the play, the words which appear on the page, not just their dictionary meanings, but uh, their connotations, their cultural connotations, and some other textualist information that you may require. The other thing I would suggest, if you are a student, is that this has been under scrutiny by some of the finest Shakespearean critics, starting with Elsie Knights, and then J.W. Wilson, right up to the new historicists like Greenblatt. It has always been subject to a lot of critical scrutiny, and I think it is important to know a little more about these perspectives. Those will definitely help you.
Your analysis was very profound, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the comment.
yes among audience.
Sir,
Anybody?
good evening.
Yes, please.
Good evening, sir. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, please go ahead.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Sir, I had a question. Look, you could and why Macbeth actually went on to kill Duncan and assume power, try to power. We can understand that it was Lady Macbeth who goaded on to him and he went ahead. But my question is, why is it that Lady Macbeth wanted Duncan to be killed? Is it to husband as a king? What are the gains in that? Because once Macbeth assumes power, he almost forgets Lady Macbeth.
Yes.
and the kind of intimate relationship that they shared is almost nullified. So,
Yes.
what is it there for Lady Macbeth in all this?
One of the
I hope I'm
answers,
clear, sir.
yeah, you are very clear. It's a good question. One of the answers given to such a question is that there's nothing for Lady Macbeth, in fact. There were interpretations trying to show her as an inhuman person, a psychologically deformed person, etc. And I don't think so, because however cruel her suggestions may appear to be, she is doing it all for Macbeth and nothing at all for herself. You see. And this, I think, is what one should understand. And that's the reason why when the doctor and the nurse witness the sleepwalking scene, I think that's where the sympathy of the spectators go out to Lady Macbeth. Though we know what she did, our sympathy goes out because here is a person who has paid a terrible cost, from which he never recovers, and gone through suppressed pain and something that leads to her suicide or death. Now, this is, though it may sound paradoxical, all that violence and cruelty she was preaching to Macbeth was only for his success and not much for her at all. And as you were pointing out, she becomes almost marginal once the banquet scene is over. I think that's somewhere the turning point, because all those scenes, till then, it is Lady Macbeth who is trying to shape Macbeth into the kind of powerful person she wants him to be. But from that turning point onwards, she is the one who suffers, and she is the one who can no longer articulate what is happening inside her, except through these gestures of constantly trying to wash those last drops of blood, etc. And then you understand that the claims she had made, of not being human at all. You remember that famous line she speaks: even if a baby were to be sucking my milk, if I wanted power or something, I would have dashed the brains of that baby. Uh, the very unnaturalness of that language tells us that Lady Macbeth is not that. She's forcing herself to be that, inhuman, without feeling, so that she can make Macbeth more of a man. And this is a terrible sacrifice. It's almost like selling your soul to Satan. That's how I would look at Lady Macbeth. Then, of course, the question you raise remains: what does Macbeth want? And the answer I try to give is somewhere there is this force within us. We don't really understand it fully even now, which wants power, which wants some kind of subordination of the others. We don't know where it lurks, how it works, what language it chooses, but it is there. Maybe that's what the play is trying to tell us.
Yes, among audience, anybody can take over the interaction.
Good evening, sir.
Hello.
Yes, good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Sir, my question, yes, sir. My question is, so you talked about and discussed about uh, like response and okay, that is the resistance. Yeah, resistance in this Macbeth, and even there was a common man resisting his tyrannical attempt. But okay, I'm not directly suggesting that the present contemporary issue in that way, but the common man what now we are seeing, they are in like a psychological trance, and they are not able to resist that. So to most of the thing, and in that way, how we can interpret? Because I'm not no, the present scenario is like that way,
Yeah.
and how we can just okay expect common man, how we can arouse that common man stimuli to okay resist this tyrannical approach. That's what the present relevance. Okay, the present relevance of the Macbeth.
Okay, you're
Uh,
right. You're right. I agree with you. But what we should remember is I'm not just talking about India, I'm talking about the global scenario. This is an extraordinary phase. Somebody may describe it as the rise of the right, or somebody may call it fascism. I don't know. But this is a very, very painful thing. I'm not pointing my fingers at anybody. I'm saying across the globe. Um, there are very serious issues for human beings, but they're not able to confront those issues and think about those issues because there are illusions which have been created for them. And your question is, in such a world, where do you expect the common man to build up resistance? Right, because as I said, we are now confronting a very unique kind of a special kind of a situation. The play Macbeth shows a different possibility. The common people there, you can say Duncan's son has a stake because he knows he will become the king. You may even say that about Macbeth. He wants to take his vengeance because his family has been killed, and he also perhaps will be one of the important leaders. But the common people there, and the common people may not appear directly in the play, but they are reported, and their responses are reported to us. They are resisting because their ethical sense has been violated. You know, their instinctive sense of right and wrong. You know, the idea that you can't kill a king and then occupy power, or that you can't have this. Macbeth says, "In every house of every leader, I have appointed a paid servant or a spy." Occurs in the play, and that's very oppressive. And common people in the play, they are upset by it, just as the leaders also. You see, the end has been questioned. There is a restoration. Okay, Macduff kills Macbeth, and the you know the head of Macbeth is brought as that emblem of final victory against tyranny. Fine, but the last words are spoken there about how are we going to restore this. And one of the promises made is that everyone who was part of this fight against tyranny will be rewarded. And that kind of a society, maybe a court society, will be re-established. So this is the atmosphere of the play. And as you were yourself saying, you can't find a direct reflection or parallel to the contemporary world. This is operating in a very different kind of atmosphere. What I found valuable is that the play shows an instinctive sense of ethicality among these people, saying this is wrong, this is wrong, it can't happen. Maybe you also know that Shakespeare took the original story from Holinshed's Chronicles, and there are very, very different things in the Chronicle because Macbeth, of course, usurps the throne after committing murder, but we are told that for 17 years he was a very good ruler after that. That's what the Chronicle tells us. Whereas Shakespeare doesn't do that. He shows a tyrant who is a murderer. He has no place. He can't be a good ruler. That's those are interesting aspects of Macbeth for me.
Thank you, sir.
audience can take over the discussion.
Prakash,
Sir,
if you permit me, I would like to draw the attention of Professor Rajendra Chenni sir to one of the statements of.
sir, please, sir. Sir, please, sir.
Thank you, because I've already done my job. I don't have to interfere. Sir, I think Greenwald is more interested in the nature of tyranny and in the nature of tyrant. In his book, he makes a statement. I would like to draw your attention to that statement, and also I'm happy if you comment on it. He argues the tyrant is driven by a range of sexual anxieties, a compulsive need to prove his manhood, the dread of impotence, a nagging apprehension that he will not be found sufficiently attractive or powerful, a fear of failure.
Yes.
This is his statement. I request you to comment on this, sir.
There is this contradiction in the making of a tyrant. On the one hand, he believes in hypermasculinity, that all the things that you require as a ruler are only manly things. There's hardly any space for a woman in it. No question. This is the man's world when you are talking about tyranny and political power. But at the same time, the obverse of this, the other side of the same coin, is maybe there is a lurking fear and lack of confidence. I don't want to stretch it too much, as many critics have done, but there certainly is a purpose in the frequent use of man enough in the play. I would treat them as two faces of the same coin. One is this obsession with being hyper masculine, and the other side of it is also being insecure about it. Always feeling that you may not be able to prove it. That I think is somewhere there. I don't want to go into speculative questions like, oh, is it in the chronicle Macbeth was the second husband? I don't. I want to stick to the play, and the play I'm sure tells us about the twin emotions. I should say. Okay.
Thank you so much, sir. We have learned a lot from you about Macbeth and tyranny and the tyrant and so on. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think we are moving towards the conclusion, Prakash.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Okay.
sir. We have almost come to the end.
Yeah.
Okay.
If audience, yes. Thank you all. Almost for about 1.5 hours. I hope all if you have enjoyed Professor Rajendra Chenni sir's talk on Macbeth. Dear audience, as I already mentioned, Darwada Katte has started the first series in English, that is on revisiting Shakespearean theatre. Today is the first session. I thank Professor Rajendra Chenni for being with us and also for his wonderful talk.
Prakash,
Sir.
please announce the second speaker, next week's speaker.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Dear audience, next week, that is July 23rd, we have Professor Amit Kumar sir's talk. Professor Amit Kumar sir, Professor of English, EFLU, Hyderabad. He is going to deliver his talk on Tempest. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
I thank Professor Rajendra Chenni, sir, for his valuable talk. I also thank President Darwada Katte, Professor Basavaraj Donur sir, for making all it is possible and being the backbone of the event. I also thank the members of Darwada Katte who are behind the screen and making all the preparation for all these events. I thank our media persons who are making it possible to reach all the events in their print media, in their electronics media as well. I thank the audience who are with us on our social media channels. We have Facebook page, Instagram, we have YouTube channel, and also on this virtual mode every week, the audience are always with us. I thank them also. Again, I thank one and all. And the coming Saturday, that is on July 23rd, sharp at 6 o'clock, we are be with us. We are with us, Professor Amit Kumar sir. Thank you, one and all. Good night.